This is our final Governance, Law, and Economics lecture for the semester. The Governance, Law, and Economics lecture series is designed to highlight the three institutions that have to work together to support and defend a free civil society where people can use your gifts and talents to enhance human flourishing. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Felix Livingston. He's a professor of economics and business at Flagler College, and he's been there since 1999. From 2007 to 2014, he served as the chair of the Department of Business Administration, and now he serves as the director of the Honorable Entrepreneurship Program, which includes a minor that teaches students how to start a company and run a company honorably. Previously, he had served in numerous capacities at several colleges, including being the Dean of the College of Business at Jacksonville University in Florida, and the Dean of Institutional Research and the Joseph A. Hardy Professor of Economics and Entrepreneurial Studies at Washington and Jefferson College in Pennsylvania. He is a longtime advocate of entrepreneurship education, and he launched a nationally recognized entrepreneurial studies program when he was at Washington and Jefferson College. He also served for 3 years as Vice President and Ambassador at Large for the Foundation of Economic Education, and during that time, Dr. Livingston traveled extensively promoting the understanding of markets in entrepreneurship. He created and managed an international network of more than 200 discussion clubs, including 43 in the United States and in 19 different countries. He's received numerous awards from the editors of the Journal for Private Enterprise, and in 1996, his undergraduate alma mater, Pittsburgh State University, presented him with its highest alumni award. He is the past president of the Association of Private Enterprise Education and served as a member of the Levy Board of Trustees for the Freedom Foundation in Valley Forge. He has a forthcoming book titled On Private and Public Virtues of an Honorable Entrepreneur, which is set for an August release. Tonight, Dr. Livingston will be talking about what it means to be an honorable entrepreneur and how the practice of honorable entrepreneurship promotes freedom and fosters general human flourishing. So Dr. Livingston will speak for 50 minutes, and then we'll have 10 minutes of Q&A. So if you would, please join me in providing a warm ESU welcome to Dr. Felix Livingston.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yanni. I'm happy to be here. I was in Emporia State when I was an undergraduate student at Pittsburgh State. It was then called Kansas State University of Pittsburgh, Kansas. We were in the same conference, and I think I was here for a track meet. Hardest race I ever run is called a steeplechase. And you're running along a field, and you have these barriers. Some of the better athletes could hurdle them like high hurdles. I, on the other hand, had to step over them. And it was a torturous race. It was horrible. One of your best runners, though, at that time, there was a water hazard on the other side of the barrier. He tripped, fell into the water, disappeared under the water. I could see the bubbles coming up. He dropped out of the race. But back at that time, back in the day, as they say, in our conference, Fort Hays State cross country was the #1 team in cross country. Emporia was #2, Pittsburgh State #3. Nationally, same ratings. In other words, we were nationally 1, 2, and 3, just as we were in the conference. So for some reason, we had a lot of good distance runners back at that time. So I'm happy to be here. I appreciate Dr. Yanni's invitation for me to be here. During a 1985 commencement address, Russell Kirk observed that the most relevant things are discerned by men and women in many different times and countries, and a calm analysis of Tocqueville is more relevant to our present discontents than are the antics of the latest demagogue taken up by the mass media. Kirk also warned that those who ignore accumulated wisdom and who immerse themselves in the mere processes of this month's events become the prisoners of time and circumstance. I often tell my students, do more than just read contemporary books, contemporary magazines, because you do become a prisoner of the present. It's important to gain perspective. In intellectual history, much of intellectual history is like a barren desert. But periodically they have these magnificent oases. The oases populated by an Adam Smith, by an Aristotle, by a Tocqueville, by a Montesquieu. And it's so important to expose yourself to those ideas. It really helps you gain perspective. You break the bonds of the present, by dipping into those oases that occurred in past times. Now, I'm beginning my remarks this evening with these thoughts because the honorable entrepreneur that I'll be discussing is an ideal that was inspired by Alexis de Tocqueville's writings on honor and his observation that a democracy's definition of honor stands for the peculiar or particular individual character of that nation before the world. Tocqueville observed that for a social group to improve its standing in society, it's in the group's best interest to reward the behavior of its members for actions that strengthen the group. And for those people, they're accorded the honor, the name honor. For those members of the group that take actions that undermine the value of the group in the presence of the group in society, those are referred to as dishonorable members of that group. So using honor and dishonor is a way to allocate praise and blame by a particular group who wants to advance its position in society. Now, the prerequisite for the existence of property, freedom, order, and entrepreneurial flourishing from the time of the Greeks to the present has been law in the sense of abstract rules. Thus, entrepreneurs are honorable in the sense of Tocqueville when their conduct preserves or strengthens general rules of property and justice, and they are dishonorable when their pursuit of private interests weakens the extended social order's requisite institutions. The only way to achieve long-run success in an extended social order of peaceful social cooperation is to use economic means to win a daily market election, with dollar votes being cast by consumers for their preferences for products and services. Accumulating wealth using this method requires being productive and trading with others. To be successful, entrepreneurs who use economic means must continually search for better ways of serving others. And when they thrive, there is general human flourishing. Consumers benefit from the creation of new, improved, and less costly goods. And a myriad of employment opportunities are made available that facilitate pursuit of both material and non-material ends. Using economic means to achieve success can be difficult, and firms that are not up to this task will soon perish. While this process can be very challenging for entrepreneurs, it is, as Adam Smith observed, the cause of the wealth of nations. Now, while the extended order of peaceful social cooperation provides a fertile environment for entrepreneurs as a group, it is onerous for some who, for various reasons, cannot achieve or maintain profitability. To avoid the rigors of competition and guarantee themselves a return over cost, a few of these individuals, who are sometimes referred to as crony capitalists, use political means to gain unfair advantage that is conferred by political authorities. It is expedient for them to employ political means to appropriate the wealth of others using the state's apparatus of compulsion and control. And their gain comes at the expense of consumers, taxpayers, and non-preferred competitors. Accumulating wealth using the guns of government erodes general rules of property and justice and threatens the peaceful social order made possible by these rules. In my discussion tonight of honor and dishonor in business, I'll be touching on 4 areas. First, human flourishing and the rule of law. Second, the private and public virtues of an honorable entrepreneur. Third, crony capitalism's dishonor and social damage. And 4, preventing a separation of the honorable and the useful. So I'm going to talk about ancient Greece, a brief overview, ancient Rome, medieval England, early America, and then I'm going to talk about the honorable entrepreneur today. Through the ages, stable and understandable general rules, including well-defined and enforced property rights, have been important. Social upheaval is inevitable when property is confiscated without justification beyond the power of a dominant political authority. Greek epic poet Homer illustrates this principle in the very first lines of his account of the siege of Troy. Rage goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, murderous, doomed, that cost the Achaeans countless losses, hurling down to the house of death so many sturdy souls, great fighters, souls that made their bodies carry on, feasts for the dogs and birds, begin muse when the two first broke and clashed. Greek Supreme Commander Agamemnon caused this deadly dispute when he violated the rights of a lower-level tribal chieftain, Achilles. Superior power was his only justification for taking Achilles' property. Agamemnon speaks to Achilles, "You are nothing to me. You will learn just how much greater I am than you, and the next man up may shrink from matching words with me, from hoping to rival Agamemnon strength for strength." It was because of this injustice that Achilles withdrew from the siege, causing general confusion, dissension, and loss of life. Homer's Iliad illuminates the importance of general rules before Greek city-states first created constitutions that treated private property as the primary means of achieving the ideal of freedom. Now, entrepreneurs in ancient Greece were active producers and traders, but hardly anything was written about them. The primary contributions of Plato, Aristotle, and other Greek philosophers were in the areas of philosophy, math, geometry, astronomy, and any economic reasoning that took place was usually intertwined with moral and political philosophy. Plato's ideal fictional city-state, the polis, allowed a division of labor and trade, but not an accumulation of wealth, since he believed that wealth accumulation and inequality resulted from commercial enterprise, and that this was a primary cause of social turmoil and tyranny. Aristotle, who had been a student of Plato, viewed things differently. He compiled and studied the extant constitutions of 158 Greek city-states, and by looking at each state's fundamental law and political developments, after all, he was a scientist, he identified factors important for political stability, along with conditions apt to cause revolution. In the Politics, Aristotle combined these observations with ideas he had previously developed on moral philosophy. In his discussion of states that were good, Aristotle emphasized that private property and the rule of law are important for stability and economic efficiency and for the virtue of liberality. Consider these phrases from the Politics. When Aristotle wrote, "That which is common to the greatest number has the least care bestowed upon it," he showed an understanding of what today is known as tragedy of the commons. Commonly owned resources are invariably overutilized and overexploited, and private property is one way to solve this problem. Aristotle also observed that no one, when men have all things in common, will any longer set an example of liberality or do any liberal action, for liberality consists in the use which is made of property. A logical offshoot of this today is that you are not being generous when you give away other people's money. In a market economy, when you give away money that you have earned honorably, You're not giving back, you're giving, or as some might say, you're paying it forward. Aristotle concluded that good, predictable laws are always preferable to the arbitrary rule of men. He who bids the law rule may be deemed to bid God and reason alone rule, but he who bids man rule adds an element of the beast. For desire is a wild beast, and passion perverts the minds of rulers, even when they are the best of men. The rule of law was first established in Athens in early 6th century BC by Solon. Known to the Greeks as isonomy, laws were created for the noble and the base that were equal. All Athenian citizens were governed by known and general rules rather than by the caprice of tyrants. In the 5th century BC, Herodotus, who is known as the father of history, described isonomy as the most beautiful social order. Entrepreneurs flourished under the rule of law during Athens' golden age, but economic progress began to slow as isonomy was gradually replaced by the unprincipled lawmaking of political authorities. By the time Philip II of Macedonia ended Athenian democracy in 338 BC, the world's first democracy had become a democratic tyranny, where individuals were forced to obey the legislation of a capricious popular majority. Freedom and entrepreneurial flourishing disappeared when the Athenian Assembly's unbounded rule replaced the ideal of isonomy. Moving to ancient Rome, most intellectuals focused on history and law, and they contributed very little to an understanding of Roman business and entrepreneurship. The fortunes of economic traders were primarily advanced through the development of Roman law and legal theory. One of the most important declarations of the first written Roman law, known as the Laws of the 12 Tables, was that no privileges or statutes shall be enacted in favor of private persons to the injuries of others contrary to the law common to all citizens. The law also gave protection to the owners of property. Property acquisition and possession was the subject of Table 6, while Table 7 addressed rights concerning land. If property was invaded, then there was an obligation to make restitution and pay reparation for damages. In many cases, a pecuniary fine was also imposed. The importance of property rights in ancient Rome was reflected in the writings of poet Virgil. In the Aeneid, Virgil tells the story of a climactic fight between Aeneas, who was a member of the royal family of Troy, who had fled to Italy when Troy fell, and Turnus, king of a legendary tribe known as the Rutulians. Aeneas charges toward Turnus, who finds himself without a weapon. As Turnus looks about, he sees, quote, an ancient giant stone that lay at hand, by chance upon the plain, set there as boundary mark between the fields to keep the farmers free from border quarrels. This stone was the physical representation of a moral rule. A person's claim to a crop's yield on his parcel was considered just because he had planted, cultivated, and harvested the crop. These efforts gave individuals the right to consume the crop or to sell the crop's yield as they chose. By the 1st century BC, isonomy and enterprise were both in decline in the Roman Republic. And toward the end of the Republic, historian Sallust wrote, "At no other time has the condition of imperial Rome been more pitiable. In every community, those who have no means envy the good, exalt the base, hate what is old and established, long for something new, and from disgust with their own desire for general upheaval, men who were beggars and without character and with unlimited hopes respect their country as little as they do themselves." From the beginning of the Western Roman Empire to its end in 476 AD, there was a close connection between economic flourishing and political stability. Enterprise and general prosperity were generally diminished under emperors not bound by law who exercised their power to confiscate the wealth of others, either their enemies or for other spurious reasons. From the 2nd century AD onward, entrepreneurial activity was also impeded by rapidly advancing state socialism. Moving to England, the Magna Carta in 1215 provided a foundation stone for the English rule of law. The product of a struggle for power, it gave formal protection to individual rights that had been evolving for more than a century following the Battle of Hastings, which occurred in 1066. William the Conqueror had disarmed the English in areas of potential rebellion, and he had expropriated their estates. He established feudal law and divided England into 700 baronies that were presented to his captains. Each estate's chief tenant shared his lands and collected duties for himself and for the king, who was initially able to confer and withdraw these estates arbitrarily. But over time, in exchange for the barons' military service, a succession of kings following William granted them rights incrementally in the use of the estates, and the barons were ultimately given permission to bequeath property to their heirs. The barons began to regard themselves as owners of the estates, and their wealth and influence increased so much that in 1215, King John, who was William the Conqueror's great-great-grandson, was unable to evict them. The barons forced the king to sign this seminal document, from which a rule of law evolved that sparked English entrepreneurship and human flourishing, and that profoundly affected the thinking of America's founders. The rule of law meant that individuals could not be punished and property forfeited unless written law was violated, as interpreted by ordinary courts following legal precedent. Equality before the law meant that every person was subject to the jurisdiction of regular courts, regardless of their rank or position in society. No person was above it, and no one would be unfairly targeted in its application. And freedom under the law meant that no person would be subject to the arbitrary will of another. In America, during the decade following the Declaration of Independence, there was excessive corruption and demagoguery in the Continental Congress and the states, and that institutional safeguards that were supposed to protect liberty and property were rapidly deteriorating. From this experience, and based on their understanding of the historic importance of general rules of justice and property, the framers of our Constitution lacked confidence that powerful individuals could be trusted to promote the ideal of liberty and protect it. When they convened the Constitutional Convention in 1787, they were guided by David Hume's observation that when a constitution is being drafted with its checks and controls, every man ought to be supposed a knave and to have no other end in all his actions than private interests. James Madison expressed this clearly in Federalist 51 when he wrote, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself." Remember, a government that's powerful enough to give you what you want is also powerful enough to take away what you have. And so the founders limited the personal political power of political officials through the use of impersonal restrictions such as the rule of law and due process. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights gave property rights the same level of protection given to the most important non-material rights because the founders believed that freedom of religion and speech are meaningless unless a person can keep the fruits of his own efforts. James Madison wrote in the Federalist Papers and commented at the Constitutional Convention. After all, he was the record keeper at the Constitutional Convention. Political freedom can best be attained through the protection of private economic rights. And Alexander Hamilton considered controlling a person's subsistence as analogous to controlling his will. The severe limitation of government's coercive power and rigorously enforced private property rights unleashed a powerful, creative spirit that gave Americans a global reputation as being self-reliant and free. Operating under a rule of law has always given entrepreneurs more confidence in their planning. F.A. Hayek explains why. Under the rule of law, the government is prevented from stultifying individual efforts by ad hoc action. Within the known rules of the game, the individual is free to pursue his personal ends and desires, certain that the powers of government will not be deliberately used to frustrate his efforts. Virtues of an honorable entrepreneur. Honorable entrepreneurs foster general human flourishing in their natural habitat. Their natural habitat is the extended order of peaceful social cooperation. And their virtues are revealed by an analysis spanning over 2,000 years. From the insights of Aristotle to reflections of Austrian political economist F.A. Hayek, dimensions of honorable entrepreneurship are illuminated by Roman orator Cicero, whose writings introduced Aristotle's thinking to many of America's founders. They didn't read Aristotle, they learned about Aristotle by reading Cicero. French political philosopher Baron de Montesquieu, whose theories dominated discussion during America's Constitutional Convention. And of course, how could we forget the Scottish father of modern economics, Adam Smith, whose ideas in the theory of moral sentiments provided an essential framework for his later explanation of how private interests, when pursued honorably, are a cause of the wealth of nations. Just as Aristotle wrote Ethics 17 years before he wrote The Politics, so did Adam Smith write Theory of Moral Sentiments 17 years before he wrote The Wealth of Nations. One of the greatest things I think people like Dr. Yanni and I regret is that economists focus exclusively on the wealth of nations. They've forgotten to talk about the moral framework that he presents lucidly in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. Aristotle believed that individuals of superior refinement consider honor to be the highest final good, and a cultivation of virtue is a means by which happiness can be achieved. Consider an honorable entrepreneur's internal and external goods. Internal goods, I advanced this a bit prematurely, but there it is. Internal goods are the intellectual virtues of insight, imagination, and practical wisdom, and the moral virtues of courage, prudence, liberality, and justice. External goods in the practice of honorable entrepreneurship includes profit, wealth, and honor. Now, if Aristotelian virtue is defined as, quote, an acquired human quality, the possession and exercise of which tends to enable us to achieve those goods which are internal to practices, then the virtue of just conduct in the practice of honorable entrepreneurship entails achieving excellence using economic means to acquire external goods of material success while knowing and exercising those internal qualities that strengthen and preserve the institution upon which the extended social order depends. Achieving the external good of profit in an extended social order requires excellence. It requires imagination. It requires a continual search for better and more efficient ways of satisfying the unmet needs of consumers. Economist Israel Kirzner has identified standards of entrepreneurial excellence that can produce profit while increasing a community's wealth through provision of better products, transformation of resources into new and useful ways, and astute entrepreneurs are calculating agents who are alert to opportunities that are just around the corner, that may turn up. They recognize opportunities that others don't see because they know when to obtain information and how to deploy it. In his comparison of someone who has imagination and someone who does not, Montesquieu observed they see things as differently as two fictional characters, heroes, one of whom is captivated by what he sees and the other one not. While the first sees crystal walls, ruby roofs, silver streams, diamond tables, the other perceives only hideous rocks and an arid countryside. Imaginative entrepreneurs do clearly think differently than pedantic business managers who have no imagination. Honorable entrepreneurs are guided and constrained by overlapping material and non-material factors in their private and public virtues are really inextricably linked. Self-interest, for example, is the interest of a researcher who discovers the cure for a virulent disease, the interest of a philanthropist who spends her previously accumulated riches helping people in need, and the interest of an innovator who enriches himself by making shoes affordable for the poor. Many honorable entrepreneurs have achieved wealth and happiness in the service of others by creating new forms of business, improving ways of relocating things in time and space, and unlocking and transforming the world's hidden resources. The world is a solid ball of resources waiting to be discovered by honorable, imaginative entrepreneurs. Honorable entrepreneurs constantly evaluate their businesses and themselves with an eye on continual improvement. And their acute awareness of opportunity is expressed by one of my favorite Shakespearean metaphors. There's a tide in the affairs of man, and taken at the flood leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries. The importance of just conduct for social cohesion and human flourishing was emphasized by Adam Smith when he wrote that the prevalence of injustice must utterly destroy a society. Justice is the main pillar that upholds the whole edifice. If it is removed, the immense fabric of human society, the fabric which to raise and support seems in this world, if I may say so, to have been the peculiar and darling care of nature, must in a moment crumble into atoms. There's a single political principle that can guide just conduct in political life. An honorable entrepreneur does not support use of political means to advance his or her firm's interests if the ends pursued can only be achieved in absence of this legislation through the use of force, fraud, and theft. In Plato's dialogue, The Republic, Socrates argues that while truth is valuable and should be generally revered, a case can be made for a lie perpetuated by a city-state's rulers if the lie strengthens the philosopher king's ability to effect a good and just society. A political authority that carefully foments such a deception can create benefits for citizens in much the same way that a doctor can improve their health by prescribing medicine. This is known as Plato's noble lie. A noble lie can strengthen the resolve of warriors who are charged with guarding the city and keeping the peace, and can deepen citizen loyalty to the Republic's first principles. Now, while it's debatable whether or not that can be justification for a noble lie today, Plato was absolutely clear that citizens should never be deceived if the effect of such rhetoric is to undermine a political society's ideals. This is why deceptions, commonly used by crony capitalists to gain preferential advantage using political means, are ignoble. In addition to sacrificing the material well-being of consumers, taxpayers, and non-preferred competitors, the dishonorable entrepreneur's partial truths, and in some cases outright lies, damage the public good by violating and diminishing respect for the extended order's general rules of property and justice. Let me give you a few examples of ignoble deceptions. When import tariffs were imposed on steel in the early part of this century, it was said to be justified because 18,000 jobs in the steel industry were saved. What was left unsaid is that the number of jobs lost in steel-using industries exceeded the total of number of people employed in the steel industry. And when a program that subsidizes ethanol production using a large amount of corn and saying it's justified that it improves the environment, what is left unsaid is that large amounts of carbon-based fuels are required to fertilize, to cultivate, to harvest corn, and still more is required to process and truck the ethanol to refineries. It is claimed that import tariffs on sugar are worth the cost to save sugar jobs. Do you know what? Because of these tariffs, American consumers must pay, on the average, twice the world price of sugar. Each sugar job saved costs $600,000 a year, and 4 jobs in sugar-using industries are lost for every sugar job saved. Almost all of the more than 1,000 occupations that now require licenses to basically work in a market, they're usually justified by claiming that consumers must be protected from unscrupulous or untrained practitioners. One such occupation, hair braiding, is a skill that is passed on from generation to generation and can be a source of economic self-sufficiency for individuals who have limited financial resources and little formal education. Now, hair braiding isn't really taught in most cosmetology schools, but it's widely regulated, even though there seem to be no ill effects in the 11 states that only require compliance with basic sanitation guidelines. This is a significant barrier to entry for hair braiders, who in some cases must take up to 1,000 hours of coursework, nothing in hair braiding, and pay as much as $20,000 to be licensed to be a hair braider. This is scandalous. This is absolutely scandalous. The examples I have given are the tip of a crony capitalist iceberg. Crony capitalism is a hydra-headed monster of legal plunder. Examples of preferential legislation, I've given you some. Others are, well, I've listed them there. Price supports, targeted tax breaks, subsidies, tariffs, quotas, voluntary export restraint, favorable regulation, bailouts, loan guarantees, non-competitive bidding. Misuse of antitrust laws. Occupational licensing. The ever-expanding web of complex and confiscatory rules that is now being spun by crony capitalist and compliant political authorities is confounding the most intelligent and holding back the most energetic of entrepreneurs. Tocqueville predicted the final end of such intrusions. The will of man is not shattered, but softened, bent, and guided. Men are seldom forced by it to act, but they are constantly restrained from acting. Such a power does not destroy, but it prevents existence. It does not tyrannize, but it compresses, it enervates, extinguishes, and stupefies people. Legal plunder that is justified by ignoble deception or outright lies. It was talked about by French political philosopher and economist Friedrich Bastiat. Not only is it an evil in itself, it is also a fertile source for further evils because it invites reprisals. If such a law, which may be an isolated case, is not abolished immediately, it will spread, multiply, and develop into a system. In some ways, legislation in America has already become a veritable system of legal plunder. It seems that the easiest way for politicians to be elected is to advocate preferential policies that benefit their constituents, including crony capitalists. While these policies may provide short-term benefits to their supporters, the long-run costs are immense. Again, Bastiat, when law and morality contradict each other, the citizen has the cruel alternative of either losing his moral sense or losing his respect for the law. Montesquieu observed, there are two sorts of corruption. One, when the people do not observe the laws. The other, when they are corrupted by the laws. An incurable evil because it is the very remedy itself. Dishonorable crony capitalists and their political advocates pose a significant threat to America. Such a danger was illuminated by Montesquieu, whose ideas were widely discussed by the founders during the Constitutional Convention. His name was frequently mentioned in the Federalist Papers. He's known as the Great Honorable Montesquieu. He really had a profound influence during when the framers were putting together the Constitution. His idea was, of course, checks and balances within government, but he also said that human flourishing is likely to occur when there's a diffusion of power throughout society, not just within government, but throughout society. This requires a moderate government with adequate checks and balances, and it also calls for non-governmental authorities, such as churches, universities, owners of private property, and the role of these people is to actively counterbalance political power. Montesquieu regarded social authorities who stand between government and the general population as a necessary reinforcement of a constitution's separation of powers. This was echoed by James Madison in Federalist 48, when he observed that a written constitution is only a parchment barrier against tyranny. If you looked at the Soviet Union's constitution before the fall of the Berlin Wall, you would marvel at the wonderful democratic society, the just and honorable society that this constitution represented. There were no social authorities in that state to counterbalance the power of the politicians. If you're a tyrant, what do? You get rid of competing social authorities. You abolish the church. You confiscate the land. That's what Stalin did. A despotic state does not have complex social gradations. If there are no competing social authorities to check and constrain governmental power, a ruthless despot can flatten all others into one subservient class. Now, in America, Montesquieu's ideal can be described as a triune social order, consisting of three systems: a competitive market-based economic system, a political system that's a constitutional democracy, and a moral cultural system that embraces the ethic of pluralism. Each system depends on the other two, and each system to function effectively must have support from the other two. For example, a market economic system requires well-defined and enforced property rights, and a culture that doesn't view wealth creation as a zero-sum game. A constitutional democracy can only achieve political freedom if there's economic freedom in a culture that respects diversity. And finally, a moral cultural system's pursuit of truth through experience, divine revelation, and philosophical reasoning is nourished by political liberty and general economic flourishing. Now, despite this interdependence, the ends and the time cycles vary among the three systems, and different paths must be traversed to reach each system's pinnacle. Because of these differences, the power accumulated by individuals and groups who ascend in one system is checked and constrained by centers of power in the other two systems. The honorable entrepreneur is a make-weight against centers of power in the political and the moral cultural systems. Freedom and general human flourishing are threatened when power gathers over the triune social order. Through the prism of Montesquieu, crony capitalism represents a dangerous confluence of power across America's economic and political systems. Cicero believed that the most difficult ethical challenge faced by leaders who are pursuing their private interests is to prevent the separation of the honorable and the useful. He illuminated this point in a book written in 44 BC, a year before he was assassinated. His book on duties was prepared for his 21-year-old son who was studying philosophy and oratory in Athens. Cicero wanted to tell his son personally these lessons, but because of political reasons, he wasn't able to venture far outside of Rome. So he wrote the book. Now, while Cicero was primarily interested in the honor of individuals in public life, his insights are also applicable to entrepreneurs pursuing their private interests in an extended social order. For Cicero, all forms of honor require cultivating. You have to cultivate certain duties. And if you neglect those duties, you're dishonorable. Leaders must identify which plans of action are honorable. Next, they must determine actions that can help them achieve outcomes that are personally beneficial. And finally, they must discern whether or not actions deemed to be beneficial are also honorable. Uncertainty characterizes consideration of all three questions, and ambivalence occupies the minds of those who perceive that beneficial actions may not also be honorable. Cicero observed that honor is derived from actions associated with the virtues of wisdom, courage, moderation, and the most illustrious virtue, justice, which is the preservation of, quote, fellowship among men with assigning to each his own and with truthfulness to agreements one has made. Thus, when choosing among duties, the first priority should be accorded to the class of duties grounded in human fellowship. A just society fosters harmony and peaceful cooperation. That is the source of our greatest accomplishments. The most widespread fellowship existing among men is that of all with all others. And when individuals violate the private rights of others, such as is done by crony capitalists, they are violating the law of human fellowship. Cicero wrote, For one man to take something from another and to increase his own advantage at the cost of another's disadvantage is more contrary to nature than death, than poverty, than pain, than anything else that may happen to his body or external possessions. If political power used to commit acts of plunder is the lion of coercion, the political authority is the lion of coercion. The crony capitalist is a treacherous little fox who masks his selfish intentions with ignoble rhetoric, extolling the public benefits of his hoped-for private privileges. Now, the lion and the fox can both engage in unjust acts. Nothing deserves our disdain, wrote Cicero, more than that of men, just at the time when they are most betraying trust, act in such a way that they might appear to be good men. It's the little fox, the crony capitalist fox, that is the most to be disdained. Crony capitalists, notwithstanding their usefulness in running businesses, fail Cicero's test of ethics. They are barred from Aristotelian virtue, and they are not honorable in the sense as conceived by Tocqueville. Now, it's interesting that most business and economic students don't understand this, and they are unaware of the importance of preventing the separation of the honorable and the useful. Part of this reason for this is that economics, as it is currently taught, lacks a soul. In an essay published at the beginning of this century, James Buchanan observed that while science and self-interest, especially as combined, do indeed lend force to any argument, something more is needed to inspire individuals who have an inner yearning to become a participant in an ideal social order. There must be a reverence for the soul or the moving spirit of that order. In a social order made possible by general rules of property and just conduct, individuals who use superior prudence, defined by Adam Smith as a combination of the best head and the best heart, those who use superior prudence in the practice of honorable entrepreneurship are the personification of its soul. The honorable entrepreneur is a personification of the missing, invisible soul of the extended social order. Economists who ignore the peaceful social order's moving spirit make it vulnerable in a competition with alternative systems such as socialism. I believe that the continuing allure of socialism, despite clear evidence of the extended order's superiority in many respects, in terms of productivity, in terms of material abundance, in terms of liberty, it may be due to socialism's comprehensive vision that transcends both science and self-interest. The soul of socialism and its motivating spirits are categorically and dramatically different from the extended social order's soul. But how can the latter's ideal effectively inspire people when its professional advocates, the economists, are reluctant to even acknowledge the soul of their position? Because competition in the pursuit of profit has increasingly become a competition among coalitions seeking mutual exploitation. The magnificent but hidden soul of the extended social order is being diminished as effectively as it has been decimated in other parts of the world by misguided efforts at collective command. Business graduates are blithely ignorant about the social waste and damage of crony capitalism because their textbooks, even volumes on business responsibility and ethics, do not touch on this subject. I researched this. I ordered desktop copies of 12 of the top business and society and business ethics textbooks. Not one of them mentioned the idea of legal plunder, and that even though something may be legal, if it undermines the great social order, you shouldn't do it. And so what does that mean? Anything that's legal becomes part of a legitimate toolkit of someone going into business. Well, it may be true that understanding virtues and honor in the practice of entrepreneurship is not required to launch and run a company. Such ignorance increases the likelihood that our future business leaders will participate in existing or newly formed crony alliances. As a final note, adherence to the internal goods of virtue in the pursuit of profit and wealth is essential for America's future because freedom and virtue are interdependent. Aristotle observed, we can only acquire moral virtues if we are free to choose and we exercise the right choices. We become builders by building, lyre players by playing the lyre. So too we become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, brave by doing brave acts, and I will say this, honorable by doing honorable acts. At the same time, we can only be free. Oh, I think I made a mistake there, sorry. It's on the same thing. Nobody's put it right. Can only be free if we are virtuous. Edmund Burke said it this way, men are qualified for civil liberty in exact proportion to their disposition to put moral chains upon their own appetites. Society cannot exist unless a controlling power upon will and appetite be placed somewhere. And the less of it there is within, the more of it there must be without. It is ordained in the eternal constitution of things that men of intemperate minds cannot be free. Their passions forge their chains or fetters. Well, I began this evening with Russell Kirk's words, and I'll end with the words of Irving Babbitt from his 1924 book, Democracy and Leadership. The unit to which all things must finally be referred is not the state or humanity or any other abstraction, but the man and woman of character. Compared with this ultimate human reality, every other reality is only a shadow in the mist. The root system of honorable entrepreneurship is enlightenment, and its taproot is conscience. Many of you are going to go on to be business leaders. And so I encourage you to acquire as much enlightenment about the practice of honorable entrepreneurship as you can. Embrace justice by engaging in just acts, and light a candle to inspire others. Scottish poet Robert Burns wrote, "All the darkness in the world can't put out the light of one wee candle." Darkness has no resistance to light. Crony capitalism has no resistance to enlightenment and courage. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate it. Thanks.